Chapter 1: Unexpected Roommates. Grace Roberts clicked off her laptop and sank into the plush couch in her apartment, rubbing her temples as she listened to the news anchor drone on. A new pandemic had forced the city into lockdown, upending the daily lives of millions. For Grace, it was both a relief and a nuisance. Working remotely was no issue for her as a tech executive, but the social isolation was daunting. With a sigh, she turned off the TV and stood, surveying her spacious, open-plan living room. The high ceilings and expansive windows made the space feel airy, and she loved the modern, minimalist decor. But the silence was already growing oppressive. Her roommate had left for her family's home across the country, leaving Grace completely alone. The sudden ring of the doorbell shattered her thoughts. Frowning, Grace made her way to the door and peered through the peephole. A man stood there, his eyes focused on a phone in one hand, his other dragging a wheeled suitcase. Grace didn't recognize him, but something about his posture and the familiar way he glanced up told her he wasn't a complete stranger. "Hello?" she called through the door. The man looked up and smiled sheepishly. "Hi. I'm David James." "You must be Grace." Grace was taken aback. She hadn't been expecting anyone. "Yes, that's me. What can I help you with?" "Your roommate, Jessica, mentioned that you might have an open room since she's staying with her parents." "My apartment lease ended, and with the lockdown, I couldn't get a new place. She suggested I stay here." Grace blinked, processing the unexpected news. Jessica had indeed mentioned that her brother might need a temporary place to stay. Grace hadn't given it much thought at the time. "I wasn't aware that you were coming so soon," she finally said, unlocking the door and letting him in. "Yeah, things changed quickly," David replied as he stepped into the apartment, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "Thank you for letting me crash here. I promise I'll stay out of your way." He was taller than she'd imagined, with curly hair and a friendly smile. Dressed in jeans and a casual t-shirt, he looked every bit the musician Jessica had described. Grace led him to the spare room down the hall. "It's nothing fancy, but it should work," she said, opening the door to reveal a tidy, sunlit room. "The bed's made, and there's a closet and dresser. Let me know if you need anything else." "This is perfect, thanks," David replied, setting his suitcase down. "I appreciate you sharing your space. I'll try to make this as painless as possible." Grace offered a polite smile before retreating to the kitchen. She busied herself with preparing dinner, her thoughts drifting to the new roommate down the hall. She hadn't planned on sharing her sanctuary with anyone, especially not a musician who, from Jessica's stories, was carefree and unpredictable. As the aroma of roasted vegetables filled the air, David appeared at the kitchen entrance, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Smells amazing. Can I help with anything?" "I'm fine, thanks," she replied curtly. "But you're welcome to join me for dinner." He accepted the invitation with a smile, and they soon sat across from each other at the small dining table. Grace felt the conversation was stilted at first, but David's easygoing nature and curiosity gradually coaxed her into a rhythm of exchanging stories and laughter. "So, how's it been working from home?" David asked, twirling his fork. "I hear it's a big change for some people." Grace shrugged. "It has its perks, but I miss the energy of the office. And my team. It's hard keeping things coordinated remotely." "Yeah, I can imagine," David said, nodding thoughtfully. "My band and I were supposed to go on tour this spring, but that's out the window now. I guess I'll just be strumming on my own for a while." "I don't know if it's the same, but it could be a good time to focus on writing new music," Grace suggested. "That's true," he said with a grin. "Maybe being stuck here will inspire a song or two." Grace returned the smile, feeling her initial apprehension melt away. Despite the challenges of sharing her space, she realized that David's presence might not be such a bad thing. They were both adjusting to this new, strange reality together. After dinner, Grace cleaned up while David retreated to his room. She soon heard the soft strumming of a guitar, the melody drifting through the apartment. It was calming, a gentle reminder that, despite the chaos outside, she wasn't truly alone. Grace retired to her room later that night, wondering what the coming weeks would bring. Unexpected roommates or not, they'd find their way through this new reality together. Chapter 2: Finding Rhythm. The morning sun streamed through the apartment's large windows, casting long shadows on the living room floor. Grace Roberts sipped her coffee, her gaze fixed on the city below. New York was quiet, a stillness draped over its streets. She took another sip, savoring the warmth and calm before the day's video calls and project deadlines loomed. The distant strum of a guitar floated down the hallway, signaling that David was awake. It was still early, and Grace appreciated the gentle music as a soothing background to her routine. She wasn't used to sharing her mornings with anyone, but David's presence was starting to feel like a natural part of her day. He soon appeared in the kitchen doorway, tousled hair framing his easy smile. "Morning, Grace. Need a refill?" She nodded and handed him her cup. "Thanks. So, what's on your agenda for today?" "Well," he began, pouring her coffee before filling his own, "I've been working on a new song, so I'll probably play around with that for a bit. Maybe take a walk later if it's not too crowded." "What about you?" "A lot of meetings, reports, and trying to keep my team motivated," she replied with a sigh. "They're not used to being away from the office." "Sounds intense," David said sympathetically. "Anything I can do to help?" Grace shook her head with a smile. "Not unless you're secretly an expert in cybersecurity and team management." "Sadly, no," he chuckled. "But if you need a quick break or a chat, I'm here." They parted ways as Grace settled into her makeshift home office, and David returned to his room with his guitar. Despite their different paths, a curious rhythm had begun to form between them. Grace worked late into the afternoon, occasionally hearing David's melodies drifting through the apartment. The soothing notes acted like a balm, easing her stress during tense video calls. As the day wound down, she noticed how the kitchen had become a neutral ground, a space where their worlds intersected. At lunchtime, David leaned against the counter, strumming while Grace made a salad, and they swapped stories about their families and childhood memories. By the time dinner rolled around, David insisted on taking over the cooking, much to Grace's surprise and delight. "Pasta primavera is my specialty," he said, chopping vegetables with impressive precision. "I learned this one from my grandma." Grace watched him work, amused by his enthusiasm. "Your grandma sounds like a good teacher." "She was," he said with a wistful smile. "She loved making big meals for the whole family. It was her way of bringing us all together." Dinner was a colorful, aromatic blend of vegetables and pasta, and Grace was pleasantly surprised by David's culinary skills. They lingered at the table long after the plates were cleared, chatting about everything from their favorite travel destinations to obscure sci-fi shows. "Ever been to Japan?" Grace asked, her eyes lighting up. "I went once for a conference, and I fell in love with Tokyo." "No, but I'd love to visit someday," David replied. "I've always wanted to see the cherry blossoms." "You should," Grace encouraged him. "It's magical." David leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful look crossing his face. "You know, I haven't thought about traveling in weeks. It feels strange to be grounded like this." "I know what you mean," Grace said, nodding in agreement. "But we'll get there again." The days flowed into weeks, and the initial awkwardness between them faded. They found their rhythm in shared routines, morning coffees and evening meals, and even the occasional Netflix binge session. David's laughter brought a levity to Grace's work-heavy days, while Grace's encouragement helped David refine his songs and see new creative paths. One evening, as David played an upbeat tune on his guitar, Grace hummed along from her spot on the couch. He glanced up, raising an eyebrow. "I didn't know you could sing." Grace laughed. "I can't, not really." "Could have fooled me." "You sound great." He strummed a different chord and began playing a slower, melodic song. "Come on, join me." "I promise I won't laugh." Grace hesitated before sitting beside him, shyly joining in with a soft harmony. They sang together quietly, the music filling the space between them. For a moment, the uncertainties of the world outside seemed far away. Later that night, as Grace retreated to her room, she smiled to herself. Despite their different lives and backgrounds, she felt a connection growing between her and David, a rhythm of understanding that felt comforting and secure. Perhaps, she mused, finding harmony wasn't so impossible after all. Chapter 3: Musical Conversations. In the dim light of her bedroom, Grace Roberts stretched lazily, enjoying the stillness of the early morning. Her dreams had been filled with melodies, echoing remnants of the late-night jam session she'd shared with David. Their voices had blended into a seamless harmony that left her humming long after the last note. After a quiet breakfast, Grace settled into her makeshift home office, her coffee steaming beside her laptop. She clicked through her emails, tuning out the background noise until a gentle guitar strum caught her attention. From his room, David was playing the first notes of a slow, melodic tune. It wasn't one she recognized, but it had a wistful quality that pulled at her emotions. She listened as the melody grew, intertwining soft chords with delicate harmonics. It seemed to tell a story of longing and uncertainty, a journey familiar to anyone grappling with the shifting tides of life during the pandemic. The notes rose and fell like waves, each strum rippling through the apartment. Hours later, when Grace emerged from her last meeting of the day, she wandered into the living room and found David at the kitchen table, his guitar resting in his lap as he scribbled in a notebook. He looked up and flashed a quick smile. "Hey, Grace. How's it going?" "Not bad," she replied, pouring herself a glass of water. "That song you were playing earlier, it was beautiful." "Thanks," he said, flipping his notebook closed. "I've been working on it for a while, but I still don't have lyrics." Grace leaned against the counter, her curiosity piqued. "Do you always start with the melody?" "Usually," David nodded. "It's like the heartbeat of the song. The lyrics come afterward." "What's this one about?" she asked, gesturing toward his notebook. David paused, thoughtfully plucking a string. "It's about feeling lost and trying to find your way back." "Kind of like how we're all feeling right now, I guess." Grace nodded, her gaze drifting to the windows and the skyline beyond. "Yeah, it's been a strange time for all of us." He gently strummed a chord, eyes focused on the guitar. "Want to help me brainstorm some lyrics?" Grace blinked in surprise. "Me?" "Yeah," David said with a grin. "You've got a good ear for melodies, and it would be fun to collaborate." After a moment's hesitation, she nodded and sat beside him, scanning the pages of his notebook. Together, they tossed around ideas, scribbling lines and rhymes until they settled on a theme that resonated with them both. The song took shape, and as Grace suggested phrases and melodies, David strummed along, refining the lyrics. As the evening wore on, the apartment filled with the sound of their creative collaboration. They laughed at half-baked lines and shared stories that inspired new verses. In the end, they crafted a chorus that David sang softly, the words echoing like promises through the quiet night. "Finding light in the shadows, holding on through the unknown, with you, I'm never alone." The song captured the essence of their shared journey, navigating uncertainty together. When David finally set down his guitar, he looked at Grace with a warm smile. "This is going to be amazing." "Thank you." Grace returned the smile, a sense of fulfillment settling over her. I had a lot of fun. I can't wait to hear the final version. For the next few days, Grace found herself listening for David's new melody as she worked. Each time she heard the familiar chords, she'd hum the chorus under her breath, feeling a quiet joy at their shared creation. One evening, David invited her to his room, where he'd set up a makeshift recording studio. I thought it'd be fun to record the song, just to see how it sounds, he explained. Want to join me for some harmonies? Grace hesitated, but his encouragement bolstered her confidence. She slipped on the headphones and stood by the microphone, her voice mingling with David's as they sang in unison. The recording captured every note, every inflection, and by the end, they had a polished version of their song. David grinned as he listened to the playback. This is incredible, Grace. You sound great. You too, she replied, a smile lighting up her face. Over the next few days, they shared the song with their friends and family, who all responded with enthusiasm. For Grace and David, the experience of creating something together strengthened the growing bond between them. Their musical conversations brought them closer, weaving their lives into a shared melody that promised hope and companionship. With every chord they strummed and verse they sang, Grace felt her guard slipping, her heart opening. Despite the chaos outside, she realized that the apartment had become a sanctuary, and David's presence was a comforting anchor amidst the storm. Chapter 4: Confessions and Conflicts. A light drizzle fell over the city, tapping against the apartment windows in a steady rhythm. Grace sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open, but her eyes were distant. She was struggling to focus on the latest project update, and the endless stream of emails from her team was only making her headache worse. From down the hall, David's guitar played a lively melody, occasionally punctuated by a soft hum. The tune was cheerful and light, a stark contrast to Grace's simmering frustration. She closed her laptop and sighed. The demands of remote work were wearing her down, and she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that her team was slipping further behind. She pushed back her chair and wandered into the living room, where she found David perched on the edge of the couch, strumming his guitar with a carefree grin. He looked up and beamed at her. "Hey, Grace! How's it going?" Grace managed a tight smile. "It's fine. Just busy." David's grin faded slightly as he set his guitar aside and stood. "Want to talk about it?" Grace shook her head. "It's just work stuff. I'm sure it'll blow over." He approached her with a concerned expression. "You're taking on a lot, you know. If you need a break or someone to vent to, I'm right here." Grace appreciated his kindness, but her patience was already frayed. "I know, but it's not like you can help me meet my deadlines." David's brow furrowed at the sharpness in her tone. "I'm not saying I can fix everything. But I can listen." "I don't need you to listen," Grace snapped. "I need to focus." David blinked in surprise. "Whoa, okay. I'm just trying to help." "Then stop distracting me." Grace shot back, her voice rising. "I can't think with your music blasting all day." David's expression hardened. "I didn't realize I was a distraction. You seemed fine with my music when we were recording together." "Well, things change," Grace said, her jaw clenched. "I'm under a lot of pressure right now, and I don't need you playing cheerleader." David looked hurt, but he stood his ground. "I'm just trying to be there for you, Grace. We're in this together." Grace crossed her arms defensively. "Maybe we're not as together as you think." A tense silence fell between them. David shook his head and turned away, retreating to his room without another word. The apartment felt cold and empty as the rain drummed against the windows. Grace sank onto the couch, her anger giving way to guilt. She knew she'd been harsh, but she couldn't ignore the mounting pressure she felt at work. She rubbed her temples and sighed, staring blankly at the wall. David's room remained quiet for the rest of the afternoon. The next day, they went about their routines in strained silence, carefully avoiding each other's gaze. David didn't play his guitar, and Grace missed the soft melodies that usually filled the apartment. The quiet felt oppressive, and by the evening, Grace was ready to reach out and apologize. She approached David's room, hesitating outside the door before knocking lightly. "David?" There was a pause before the door cracked open. David stood there, his face neutral as he met her gaze. "Can we talk?" Grace asked, her voice soft as he stepped aside, allowing her into the room. She glanced around, noticing the guitar leaning against the wall, untouched. "I'm really sorry about yesterday," Grace said. "I was overwhelmed, and I took it out on you." "It wasn't fair." David leaned against the desk, his arms crossed. "I know you're stressed, but I'm trying to be your friend, Grace. I care about you." "I know," she said, her shoulders slumping. "And I care about you too. I've just been feeling so much pressure lately, and I lashed out." David's expression softened. "I get that, but I need you to be honest with me. If something's bothering you, let's talk about it." Grace nodded, taking a step closer. "I promise. No more shutting you out." David sighed and uncrossed his arms, offering her a tentative smile. "Good, because I don't want to be your enemy. We're on the same team here." Grace returned the smile, relief washing over her. "You're right. And I'm grateful for your support." They stood in silence for a moment before David picked up his guitar and strummed a few soft chords. "How about I play something a little quieter?" Grace chuckled. "That sounds perfect." They spent the evening talking about their fears and hopes, sharing their uncertainties about the future. Grace opened up about her struggles with balancing work and self-care, and David confided in her about his own worries regarding his career. Their confessions paved the way for a deeper understanding, and by the end of the night, the warmth between them had returned. As they laughed together under the glow of the living room lamp, Grace felt grateful for David's patience and their renewed connection. Despite the conflicts that had shaken them, they found solace in each other's company, ready to face the challenges of the coming days hand in hand. Chapter 5: Distance and Decisions. The weeks blurred into each other as the lockdown began to ease. People slowly trickled back into the city, filling the once empty streets with a new rhythm of cautious optimism. Grace and David adapted to the new normal as they resumed some routines and ventured outside more frequently, but their cozy sanctuary still served as their primary refuge. One evening, as they lounged on the couch, Grace's phone buzzed. She glanced at the notification and saw an email from her boss, marked urgent. With a slight frown, she opened it and began reading. "What's up?" David asked, looking up from his notebook. Grace didn't reply at first, her eyes scanning the message intently. Finally, she sighed and set the phone down. "My boss wants me to attend a conference in San Francisco next week. I wasn't expecting travel to start up again so soon." David watched her carefully. "How do you feel about it?" "I'm not sure," Grace replied, her brow furrowing. "On one hand, it would be nice to reconnect with the team in person. But I don't know if it's worth the risk yet." David nodded thoughtfully. "And you'd be away for a while?" "Yeah, at least 2 weeks," Grace said, her tone uneasy. "The conference will take up the first week, and I'd stay another week to visit our headquarters." David fell silent, turning the idea over in his mind. He'd grown accustomed to Grace's presence, to their musical conversations and shared dinners. The thought of her leaving for so long left an unexpected emptiness. "Are you going to go?" he asked quietly. "I'm leaning toward yes," she admitted. "But it's not an easy decision." What if things change while I'm gone? David smiled reassuringly. We'll be okay. And hey, it's not like I'll stop writing songs just because you're not here. She laughed softly. True. I'm sure I'll hear all about them when I'm back. In the days leading up to her departure, Grace busied herself with preparations, packing her suitcase and setting up temporary remote work arrangements. She promised David that she'd keep in touch through calls and messages, but both knew that maintaining their rhythm from afar wouldn't be easy. The morning she left, David stood with her at the apartment door, holding her suitcase as they exchanged awkward goodbyes. I'll miss you, he said earnestly. But you'll do great out there. Grace gave him a tight hug. I'll miss you too. Don't let the place fall apart without me. With a final smile, she turned and walked down the hall, leaving David alone in the apartment for the first time in months. He felt the silence settle around him, a stark reminder of the absence of her laughter and the familiar click of her keyboard. The next few days were quiet. David tried to keep himself busy with songwriting and virtual band practices, but his heart wasn't in it. He missed Grace's company, her thoughtful insights, and the way she made the apartment feel like a warm, inviting haven. He called her on the third day, eager to hear her voice. How's San Francisco treating you? Busy as ever, Grace replied with a laugh. But it's nice to be back with the team. They're as stressed out as I am. David could hear the fatigue in her voice. Make sure you're taking care of yourself. I will, she promised. And you make sure you're eating more than just instant ramen. David chuckled. Yes, ma'am. Their conversation was brief but comforting, and afterward, David felt a renewed sense of purpose. He threw himself into his songwriting, crafting new melodies that he knew Grace would appreciate. But as the days dragged on, the distance between them seemed to stretch further. Their calls became less frequent, and David couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting. When Grace finally returned after 2 weeks, she seemed different, more distracted and preoccupied. They settled back into their routines, but an invisible barrier lingered between them. Grace spent long hours on her laptop, catching up on emails and projects, while David focused on refining his latest compositions. Their conversations grew sporadic and stilted, lacking the warmth and ease they once shared. One evening, David put down his guitar and sat beside her on the couch. Hey, Grace. Are you okay? She glanced up from her laptop, her brow furrowed. I'm fine, just tired. David reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. You've seemed distant lately. I'm worried about you. Grace sighed and closed her laptop. I guess I have been. It's just, being back with my team made me realize how much I've missed working with them in person. And my boss offered me a promotion if I'm willing to move to San Francisco. David felt a pang of shock. A promotion? That's great. But, you'd be leaving New York? Grace nodded slowly. It would be a big change, but it's a great opportunity. I'd have to make a decision soon. David tried to mask his disappointment with a smile. You've worked hard for this, Grace. I know you'll make the right choice. She squeezed his hand in return, her gaze searching his. I don't want to lose what we have here, David. But I can't ignore this chance. He swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. Whatever happens, I'm here for you. Grace leaned into his embrace, resting her head on his shoulder as the weight of her decision settled over them both. The next few days were filled with uncertainty and heartache as Grace wrestled with the choice before her. David tried to stay supportive, but he couldn't shake the dread that she might choose a life that didn't include him. Finally, on a quiet Sunday evening, Grace sat beside David on the couch, her hands clasped tightly together. I've decided to take the promotion, she said softly, her voice tinged with resolve. But I'm not leaving you behind. David searched her face, hope flickering in his eyes. "What do you mean?" "I want you to come with me," Grace said, her voice steady. "I know it's a lot to ask, but I can't imagine my life without you." David felt a rush of relief, a smile spreading across his face. "You're sure?" She nodded. "I'm sure. Let's start this new chapter together." In the days that followed, they made plans for their move to San Francisco, a sense of excitement mingling with the sadness of leaving their old lives behind. It wasn't an easy decision, but with Grace and David side by side, they knew they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. Their bond had grown stronger through the distance, and now, they were ready to build a future that was truly their own. Chapter 6: Love Beyond Lockdown. The early morning sun rose over the fog-shrouded skyline of San Francisco, casting a golden glow on the Victorian houses that lined the hills. Grace stood on the balcony of their new apartment, sipping coffee and breathing in the crisp air. She glanced over at David, who was tuning his guitar, a playful grin lighting up his face as he plucked a few random chords. "Ready for the big day?" he asked, strumming a cheery melody. Grace smiled, the warmth of his voice pushing away the lingering doubts. "As ready as I'll ever be." Today was the day Grace would officially step into her new role, the culmination of weeks spent settling into the city and adjusting to a new routine. Despite the initial unease of leaving New York, she found solace in David's unwavering support and the familiarity of their shared laughter. The apartment was smaller than the one they'd shared in New York, but it had a cozy charm that felt like home. The wooden floors creaked slightly, and the small balcony offered a view of the vibrant streets below. Grace loved watching the fog roll in at dusk, shrouding the city in a dreamy haze. David joined her at the balcony, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "You're going to do great today." "I know it." "Thanks," she said, leaning into him. "I just hope I remember everyone's names." He laughed softly. "You will. And if not, you can always call them Buddy." "Works like a charm." Grace playfully elbowed him, a grin spreading across her face. "I'll keep that in mind." The day was a whirlwind of introductions, meetings, and strategy sessions, but Grace thrived in the bustling energy of her new office. Her team welcomed her with enthusiasm, and she felt an overwhelming sense of belonging as they shared ideas and set ambitious goals for the months ahead. That evening, when she returned home, David had dinner waiting, a simple but delicious spread of pasta and garlic bread. They ate on the balcony, sharing stories of their days and reveling in the view of the city twinkling below. "So, what's next on your agenda, Maestro?" Grace asked, raising her glass of wine. David set down his fork and smiled. "I'm planning to connect with a few local musicians and start performing around town. Maybe even set up some virtual concerts." "That sounds perfect," she said warmly. "I'm sure San Francisco is going to love your music." "And I'm sure they're going to love your leadership," he replied, clinking his glass against hers. They settled into a comfortable silence, the sounds of the city floating up to their balcony. For the first time in months, Grace felt completely at peace. The fears and uncertainties of the lockdown had given way to hope and resilience, and she was ready to embrace the future with open arms. In the weeks that followed, Grace and David found their rhythm once more. Their routines shifted, but the core of their relationship remained unshaken. They spent their mornings together, sipping coffee on the balcony before parting ways for work and rehearsals. At night, they reunited for quiet dinners and long walks along the bay, marveling at the beauty of their new home. David's music thrived in the eclectic atmosphere of San Francisco, and his songs quickly gained a loyal following among the city's vibrant arts scene. He filled their apartment with melodies that reflected the joy and love he felt for Grace, each note a testament to the harmony they'd found together. One evening, as they strolled along the Embarcadero, David stopped and pulled Grace close, his gaze serious but tender. "You know, none of this would have been possible without you." "What do you mean?" Grace asked, tilting her head in curiosity. You believed in me, David said softly. Even when I didn't know what was next. You were always there. Grace felt a lump form in her throat as she squeezed his hand. I believe in you because I know how incredible you are. You've brought so much joy into my life, David. He smiled and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. And I want to bring you even more. Grace gasped as he opened the box to reveal a delicate ring. Grace Roberts, will you marry me? Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded. Yes. 1,000 times, yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger before pulling her into a tight embrace, their laughter mingling with the sounds of the waves crashing gently against the shore. In the weeks and months that followed, Grace and David planned their wedding, their hearts brimming with excitement for the life they'd build together. Their love had endured the trials of the pandemic, the uncertainty of distance, and the weight of new beginnings, growing stronger with each challenge. On a warm summer evening, surrounded by their closest friends and family, they exchanged vows beneath the glow of twinkling string lights. The air was filled with music and laughter as they danced into the night, their hearts beating in perfect harmony. Beyond the lockdown, beyond the uncertainties, Grace and David had found their rhythm, a love that would guide them through whatever challenges lay ahead. Together, they were unstoppable,